In this video, I'm going to try to explain inflation and hyperinflation by means of a simple analogy. The question we need to answer first is, what is inflation? Inflation is defined in classical economics as an increase in the money supply, although more correctly it should be referred to as currency creation. So we can restate this by saying that the primary cause of inflation is excessive currency creation. This phenomena is also known as money printing, although nowadays there's very little by way of physical cash in most so-called developed economies. Anyway, to put it in the plainest of terms, inflation is caused by lots of newly created currency being pumped into the system. So, if the central bank in your country, in cahoots with governments, are creating lots of new currency for whatever reason, then you will inevitably experience inflation sometime in the future. But we have to be aware that there is a time lag. As a real-world example, the Fed increased the money supply hugely during the pandemic, but it took a while for the effects to be seen in the real economy. Many countries did something similar, and we're living with those effects now. There have been some supply-side issues, but these tend to be industry-specific and are relatively minor and temporary, except perhaps for oil shortages. Time lags aside, inflation is the inevitable result of currency creation. Best to think in terms of cause and effect. The inflation rate will depend to a large extent on how much currency is created. If there's excessive amounts, it will mean that you will experience hyperinflation, but more on that a little later. All that said, let's look at the analogy. A good analogy to use when thinking about inflation is whiskey. Some people like to drink whiskey neat. Some people like to drink whiskey with ice. Some people like to drink whiskey with a little bit of water. If you add water, the whiskey becomes somewhat diluted. It's not quite so strong or not quite so potent. If you add a lot of water, the taste of the whiskey is lessened to some extent, and more importantly perhaps, it loses more of its potency in respect of each mouthful taken. If you add too much water, the taste of whiskey is virtually vanishes. Analogies are rarely perfect, but I hope you get the general idea. The same is true of a currency. It can become diluted and it can lose its potency, although different terms are used. When it comes to a currency, instead of saying adding water, the phrase used is an increase in the money supply, and for dilute, the terms used are either devalue or debase. For potency, the term used is purchasing power. Increasing the money supply, or currency creation, as it should be called, is not good for a currency. It devalues or debases the currency. A devaluation is a loss of value. The currency loses its purchasing power. This stands to reason. Anyone with a basic understanding of economics would know that scarcity strongly correlates with high value. The converse is also true. When there's an overabundance of something, the value or worth in currency terms goes down. As evidence of this, we need only look at OPEC. OPEC is a cartel of oil-producing nations in the Middle East. When they collude and limit production, the price of crude oil per barrel rises. Conversely, when they collectively increase production, the price of crude oil per barrel falls. The same is true of any commodity, and it's also true of currencies. So, when there's an overabundance or oversupply of a particular currency, it loses value. There is most definitely an oversupply of dollars, as well as other major currencies in the world, but that is perhaps a topic for another video. One thing I do wish to say is that people tend to think of inflation as being rising prices, because rising prices are where the consumer feels the hit. The consumer experiences inflation as the prices of products rising. But, in my opinion, it's a mistake to think of inflation this way. Rising prices are the end result of inflation. I would suggest that a better way to think about inflation is to see it in terms of purchasing power. Purchasing power is the ability of a currency to pay for goods and services. So, when the purchasing power of a currency decreases, the ability of that currency to pay for goods and services decreases. The loss in purchasing power means it takes more currency to buy a particular product. Hence, the rise in the numbers of that currency, rising prices. In economics, everything is relative. With inflation, essentially what is happening is that the currency has lost some of its purchasing power in relation to the product. After all, the product itself hasn't changed. A lawnmower is still a lawnmower. It hasn't magically transformed into a tractor. What has changed is the value of the currency. The currency has depreciated in relation to the product. To finish off, we need to answer the question, what's the difference between inflation and hyperinflation? In some respects, not a lot. Hyperinflation is just a more extreme version of inflation. With hyperinflation, the currency is losing its value or purchasing power at a much faster rate over time as compared to inflation. The consumer experiences this as rapidly rising prices, so the consumer sees prices rise of everyday items they're continually going up. During the hyperinflationary event in Hungary circa 1946, which was the worst ever recorded hyperinflationary event in history, prices of products doubled every 15 hours. Returning to our analogy, with hyperinflation, we can imagine someone pouring massive amounts of water into the whiskey, diluting it so much that you can no longer taste the whiskey at all. I've talked about hyperinflation because by looking at hyperinflation, it's easier to get an understanding of ordinary inflation. As I said, hyperinflation can be considered as being a more extreme version of inflation. I've talked about hyperinflation also because I believe hyperinflation is where we're headed. The numbers involved during a hyperinflationary event are pretty hard to imagine. Indeed, they're rather mind-boggling, but hyperinflation has happened in the past. Indeed, it's already happening now in various nations of the world, and there's good reason to believe that you could see hyperinflation happen again sometime soon in your country. You might not believe me, but I would say that you have to be wary about normative bias. For those of you who don't know, normative bias is the tendency to assume that everything goes against an established norm is somehow ineffective, inappropriate, or incorrect. As I said elsewhere in previous videos, we're living in extraordinary times, and so I would say that a consideration of alternative ideas might well save your life and the lives of your family and friends. And I do not say such things for the sake of sensationalism. I mean this quite literally. So you might want to entertain the possibility that I might be right. Besides, you have little to lose by thinking properly about these things. For those of you who dismiss what I say as crazy talk, I wish you the best of luck, because you're going to need it. You're going to need all the luck you can get. Wise up and rise up.